The rain drummed against Elias Thorne's black umbrella like 1,000 accusing fingers as he knelt in the mud of the Willow Creek Cemetery, his shoulders shaking with a grief that seemed to anchor him to the very earth. To the onlookers standing near the ivory mausoleums, Elias was nothing more than a tragic curiosity, a man whose presence in this exclusive, high society graveyard felt like a smudge on a pristine canvas. He clutched a single crushed lily, his fingers stained with soil, as he stared at the headstone of his wife Elena, a woman whose sudden death had sent shockwaves through the local elite, not because they mourned her, but because they couldn't believe she had married a man like him. Standing a few yards away, Julian Vane, the local real estate mogul, adjusted his designer coat and smirked at his companions, his voice carrying easily over the soft weeping of the wind. Julian didn't see a grieving widower. He saw a man he had spent years trying to push out of the city's business circles, a man who had somehow inherited one of the most prestigious estates in the county. Despite his modest background, the crowd of mourners, mostly wealthy white socialites who had tolerated Elias only for Elena's sake, whispered behind their gloved hands, their eyes darting between Elias's worn coat and the gleaming marble of the tomb. They mocked his silence, calling it the shell-shocked muteness of a man who had finally realized he was out of his depth. Julian stepped forward, his polished shoes splashing mud onto Elias's trousers, and leaned down with a sneer that didn't reach his cold eyes. He told Elias that it was a shame Elena wasn't around to see him crawling in the dirt, suggesting that perhaps now Elias would be sensible and sell the Thorne holdings for pennies on the dollar before the bank realized he was a fraud. The disrespect was palpable, a heavy fog of condescension that ignored the fact that Elias had built a tech empire from a garage, while these men were still riding their father's coattails. Elias didn't respond to the insults or the laughter that rippled through the group. When Julian suggested he go back to the inner city where things were more his speed, instead, Elias pressed his forehead against the cold stone, his tears mixing with the rain. But his mind wasn't on the insults. He was listening. He wasn't just crying for the loss of his soulmate. He was crying because he had just noticed the subtle, jagged scrape on the corner of the heavy granite slab, a mark that shouldn't have been there on a fresh burial. His grief was real, but it was suddenly sharpened by a terrifying, cold realization. The dirt beneath his knees felt too loose. The air in the cemetery felt too charged. And as he looked at the date on the stone, a faint, rhythmic scratching sound seemed to vibrate through the earth, a sound no one else heard because they were too busy laughing at the broken man in the mud. The tension in the air thickened like a physical weight as Elias stood up, his height suddenly imposing despite his drenched clothes, his eyes shifting from a glazed sorrow to a terrifying, pinpoint focus. Julian, sensing a shift but refusing to acknowledge it, continued his tirade, mocking Elias for his dramatic performance and telling him that no amount of crying would bring back a woman who was clearly too good for him. But Elias wasn't looking at Julian. He was looking at a black sedan idling at the cemetery gates, its windows tinted so dark they looked like voids. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, encrypted device that pulsed with a faint blue light, a piece of hardware his company had developed for high-level government security. As the socialites began to jeer, demanding he leave the hallowed ground he was deafling with his presence, Elias's thumb swiped across the screen. Suddenly, the laughter died in Julian's throat as every phone in the vicinity began to scream with a high-pitched emergency alert. The mocking faces turned pale as they checked their screens, seeing their own private bank accounts being frozen in real time, a silent demonstration of the power Elias had held back out of respect for Elena's peaceful life. But the true shock came when Elias spoke, his voice a low thunder that silenced the wind, telling Julian that he had 30 seconds to explain why his private security detail was currently seen on satellite footage dragging a woman into the basement of the Vane estate 3 nights ago. The crowd gasped, the shift in power so sudden it caused Julian to stumble back into the mud he had just been mocking. Elias didn't wait for an answer. He dropped the lily and pulled a sledgehammer from a nearby groundskeeper's shed, swinging it with a roar of primal fury against the side of the vault. The marble cracked, and as the heavy lid shifted, the shocking twist was revealed to the horrified onlookers. The casket was empty. Save for a weighted mannequin and a discarded oxygen canister, Elena wasn't dead. She had been taken, and the funeral was a grand, macabre ruse designed to bury her memory while Julian and his cohorts liquidated her assets. The realization that Elias wasn't a grieving pauper, but a man with the resources to track a heartbeat across a continent sent a wave of terror through the conspirators. He turned his gaze toward the sedan, which began to peel away, but Elias simply tapped his watch. A fleet of black helicopters, bearing the logo of Thorne Global Industries, crested the tree line, their spotlights turning the gray afternoon into a blinding, artificial noon. The reversal was absolute and devastating as Elias's elite security teams descended like shadows, pinning Julian and his associates to the sodden grass they had so recently stood upon. With such arrogance, the man they had mocked as a nobody now stood over them like an avenging deity, his face set in a mask of cold, calculated steel. He didn't need to say a word to Julian. The sight of his own empire crumbling as Elias's lawyers and tactical teams dismantled his life in seconds was enough. Elias ignored the pleas for mercy, his only focus being the coordinates flashing on his device. He sprinted toward the lead helicopter, leaving the wreckage of the fake funeral behind. The scene shifted rapidly to the cold, sterile basement of a remote warehouse where Elena sat bound, her eyes wide with terror but her spirit unbroken. When the doors burst open, it wasn't the police or a ransom crew. It was Elias, his coat gone, his hands bruised, looking every bit the warrior he had hidden beneath a suit for so long. The reunion was a silent explosion of relief, a moment of such raw, emotional gravity that even the hardened security guards turned away. Elena's voice, a hoarse whisper of his name, was the only thing that mattered. As they emerged into the light of a new day, the story reached its satisfying conclusion back at the cemetery, where the police were hauling away the elite socialites who had conspired in the kidnapping. Elias and Elena stood together, watching the sun rise over the valley. He had spent his life being underestimated, being laughed at by people who thought his skin color or his quiet demeanor meant he lacked the strength to fight back. But as he held Elena close, he knew the world now understood the truth. He wasn't just a millionaire. He was a man who would move heaven and earth to protect what was his. The final scene showed Elias purchasing the entire cemetery and the surrounding lands, turning the site of his greatest pain into a public park dedicated to justice, a place where no one would ever be looked down upon again. He had turned their mockery into ashes and their disrespect into a legacy of power, proving that the most dangerous man in the room is often the one they never bothered to truly see.